From the Digital Media Center, on the campus of Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. This is Ramping Up Your English, an educational program for intermediate-level English language learners. Here's your host for Ramping Up Your English, John Letts.
Welcome to Ramping Up Your English. This is our third program, Episode 3, Segment 1. Ramping Up Your English is for English language learners from all language backgrounds who've already begun the process of learning English as their second language. It's a program for people of all ages. If you're seeking greater English proficiency, this program is designed to help you reach that goal. If you know what this is, then you already know about our first theme. Your knowledge of trains and railroads will help you elevate your English for a number of language functions. In English, this is called a spike. Spikes have been used for years to hold the rails onto cross pieces of track called railroad ties. Spikes are still used today in track construction and maintenance. Thousands of spikes were once used to build the Transcontinental Railroad, linking the East and West Coast in the United States. If this program is going too fast, like a runaway train, I suggest watching episodes 1 and 2 by going to archive.org/details/RogueTV. You can also access all episodes of Ramping Up Your English at letscreate.org. We have a few things to review today from previous programs, but first, we're going to see this short video clip about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The video clip will prepare you for the language work we'll be doing later in this episode. For now, just watch and enjoy this video, Early Rails.
We're going backward in time today, back to when railroads first began to be built in the United States, and even before that. It was once all about water, and America was blessed with many navigable rivers. People and goods flocked to boats to carry them distances. To fill in between rivers and to connect them, canals were built. Even George Washington invested in a canal to move heavy cargo to markets. Wagons pulled by teams of mules and horses were still used. Those who controlled the animal teams were called teamsters. Their union is still active today, although for different work. Soon railroads began spreading quickly, moving freight and people faster than canals. 10 years before the Civil War, in 1850, railroads were firmly established in the Northeast and began trickling into what was then called the Northwest. By 10 years after the Civil War, railroads reached west beyond the Mississippi River, and the Transcontinental Railroad allowed passengers to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean in San Francisco. A big step in that direction was construction of the Eads Bridge in St. Louis, and it still spans the Mississippi River. All this railroading was made possible by the steam engine. Fuel is burned to heat water, which expands as steam and creates power to move pistons. A system using steam locomotives requires frequent stops for taking on water. No water, no steam. No steam, no power. Steam locomotives are in constant need of attention. Those who spend a lot of time with them say they seem to be alive. A steam train requires an engineer and a fireman in the locomotive, and a brakeman. In the early days, they had to move from car to car atop the train to set the brakes by hand. Each train also had a conductor. The passenger cars on early trains were simple wagons with seats. not padded seats like this coach. Building the Transcontinental Railroad was that generation's equivalent of landing on the moon. No such engineering challenge had ever been attempted. Union Pacific began laying tracks at Omaha, Nebraska, westward. The Central Pacific began at Sacramento, building eastward. The Union Pacific was able to lay track quickly in the flatness of the Great Plains, but the work was still backbreaking. The workers actually building the railroad were mostly Irish immigrants, eager to earn wages.
I was born a hard-driving railroad man. I was born a hard-driving railroad man. I was born with this 9-pound hammer in my hand. I was born a hard-driving railroad man.
Building east from the Sacramento Valley was much harder, and people from European descent were much more interested in digging for gold than building a railroad. The solution to the labor problem came from Asia. Chinese workers came, already organized into work crews, called gangs. Their ability to work amazingly hard and peacefully was legendary. Their dogged, patient work allowed the railroad to bore through mountains and lay track at high elevations, even at Donner Lake, famous for the Overland Trail disaster that included cannibalism. Building tunnels through the mountains was especially dangerous. It involved using explosives like nitroglycerin, but the Chinese workers were good at this. The workers were lowered to the mountainside in these baskets. They set the explosives, and the baskets were raised so they would escape the blast. When the baskets failed to raise, that was called going to hell in a handbasket, a saying still in use today. The Central Pacific finally broke out of the mountains and laid track across the parching desert of Nevada. It was dry and terribly hot, but it was mostly flat, allowing Central Pacific to lay track more quickly. They met the Union Pacific at Promontory, Utah in 1869, where Leland Stanford drove in the last spike, the Golden Spike. Here, the ceremony is repeated by descendants of those Chinese railroad builders. The Transcontinental Railroad made it possible to travel from coast to coast in a matter of days instead of months. The whistle of a steam locomotive became a soundtrack of life to millions in cities and small towns alike. The Overland Railroad was soon joined by other transcontinental railroads, providing a link made of steel and steam to keep our country together.
Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English, a support program for intermediate level English language learners. This concludes Episode 3, Segment 1. We'll be back with Segment 2 right after this. This is a Ramping Up Your English book review. An atlas is a collection of maps. A historic atlas is a collection of maps, photos, and illustrations that tells the reader about what happened in the past and where things happened. For the reader learning about the history of railroads, I recommend National Geographic's Historical Atlas of the United States. Many aspects of American history are beautifully illustrated here, organized around themes like immigration and industrialization. Railroad history is included here, with simple yet poignant maps illustrating the expansion, and then the decline of railroads in the United States through time. Readers can see the expanding effects of the Transcontinental Railroad and the erasing of many railroads after World War II, when automobiles, trucks, and airlines sapped away business from many of the railroads of the time. The atlas also contains regional maps of the United States. If you want to see graphic illustrations of railroad history, get your hands on a copy of National Geographic's Historical Atlas of the United States. You can probably find one at your local library. For Ramping Up Your English, I'm John Letts. Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English. This is episode 3, segment 2. This is a good time to ask yourself how much of the previous video clip you understood. Was it 100%, 50%, none at all? Whatever it is, go ahead and record that in your notebook. Write in the estimated percent and add episode 3 and the date. We'll compare that with later video clips. Speaking of your notebook, let's quickly take a look at what would be there if you'd been with us since episode 1. So let's take a look here. We have some things that were written down from the first episode. It's a log of what you understood about how much. Some vocabulary work we did in the first episode. And then we had some sentence construction using the word consists of in terms of description, and some more precise ways of doing things. You can find these on our website. Go to letscreate.org. Follow the links to episodes 1 and 2. If you'd rather not catch up, you'll still benefit by starting a fresh notebook. During our first episode, I referred to a children's dictionary, which I recommended for looking up unknown words. Unfortunately, I failed to show it, so here it is. This dictionary is comprehensive enough to contain most words you'll encounter in this unit, yet it's basic enough to help you understand the meaning. The dictionary you use depends on your level of proficiency and your age. During our second episode, we ramped up some sentences about the function of train yards. We started with these sentences typical of intermediate level English learners. We saw an equal number of sentences ramped up to a higher level. The first sentence introduced the topic, followed by a compound sentence and another sentence showing a supporting detail. Our homework then was to write sentences about the functions of these objects in the kitchen. And so this is what we ended up with our homework. Of course, the sentences you wrote will be unique. These are examples of what early intermediate English learners would be able to write. A stove cooks food. A sink is where you can get water and wash dishes. Cabinets are where you can keep food until you're ready to use it. All of these are perfectly correct sentences. They clearly state the functions of the objects in the kitchen. Now let's ramp them up like we did with the sentences about train yards. A kitchen contains a number of features that facilitate preparing food. A stove provides heat for cooking, while a sink is a source of water for cooking and cleaning. Cabinets supply storage space for food until it's ready to be prepared. The first sentence introduces the topic without a supporting detail. The second sentence is a compound sentence, providing two supporting details, and the third sentence adds another supporting detail. There's a certain rhythm to these sentence groups, a rhythm you'll likely pick up as we do these in future programs. They create a certain flow of the language that hints at fluency. These sentences are no more correct than the first example, but they communicate at a higher level of proficiency. See if you can do the same with sentences you wrote for homework. In segment 1 of today's show, we watched a video clip of early railroads, including construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. If you missed the clip, you can watch it by going to letscreate.org. In our first 2 episodes, we started building a bank of words we hear often in the video clips we watch. Most of them so far have been the names of things, what we call nouns in English. I suggest you continue this practice all through the unit. write down important words, and attempt to find their meanings. Today, we're focusing on action words, which we call verbs in English. A video about early railroads was packed with actions that took place in the past, so it's a good time to take a look at past tense verbs. So this is our learning objective today, to use past tense verbs to relate events in the past. Here are a few action words right from the video clip. Take a look at these: bless, flock, invest, pull, control, call, and establish. All of these verbs form the past tense by a method you probably already know as an intermediate English language learner. You simply add ed to the end of the word. If the word already ends in e, you add a d, and there you go. You've changed a present verb into a past tense verb. Be careful about pronouncing some of these. The ending sounds of blessed, flocked is pronounced more like a T than a D. Pulled, controlled, called, and established all end with more of a D sound without adding a syllable to the word. Of this list, only invested is pronounced with the ED as an added syllable. Early intermediate English learners often add the ed, the ed, as an extra syllable to the wrong word. That is a mistake worth celebrating because it shows that you can apply the main rule for turning verbs into past tense, but it's a stage that needs to be passed through and left behind at some point. You have probably discovered by now that English often breaks its own rules. Like many other languages in English, some of the most often used verbs form the past tense in other ways. Let's look at these present tense verbs that were used in the past tense in the video clip. Begin, build, make, set, have, are, and come. People in the early stages of learning English will treat these like regular verbs, but they soon notice that they don't sound right. Beginned, maked, setted. These are all errors I've heard when teaching English. Let's take a look at the correct way to make these verbs in the past tense. Begin becomes began, build becomes built, make becomes made, set remains a set, have becomes had, are becomes were, and come becomes came. Having English conversations, watching our videos, and reading are some of the great ways to become aware of how irregular verbs change to become past tense verbs. You can also go to our website for a list of common irregular verbs. Go to letscreate.org. You'll also find a link in episode 3 to an extended list of irregular verbs. You may even see a list in the dictionary you're using. There are just a few of the many irregular verbs to be aware of. We'll introduce more in later programs. This ends segment 2 of episode 3 of Ramping Up Your English. You can watch or download this episode and previous ones by going to archive.org/details/RogueTV. I'll be back with segment 3 right after this. This is a Ramping Up Your English book review. If you want to go back in time to the very birth of trains and railroads, you want to read the book The History of Railways by Colin Heinsohn from Scholastic Books. The book's format reminds me of eyewitness books with small illustrations and ample text. English learners will find that the text is very challenging and there's a lot of text on each page. The illustrations are clear, providing the context to help readers decipher the text. Historical photos depict important events like the Golden Spike ceremony that joined the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads as America's first intercontinental railroad. There's a great amount of information in the history of railways. Readers will stretch their English reading skills, but you'll also be rewarded by a deeper knowledge of trains and railroads. Meanwhile, you'll be ramping up your English proficiency, especially in reading. For Ramping Up Your English, I'm John Letts. Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English. This is segment 3 of episode 3. In segment 1, we watched a video clip about the early days of railroads. These were times when trains were pulled by steam locomotives. Let's look at a science of steam, the steam power that made all of this possible. We'll start by seeing a brief video clip that shows a science experiment by some elementary school students. They're heating water in a test tube by using heat from a candle. Let's see how it works out.
This is the action-reaction lab. We've been working on a few labs in science and we decided to pick this one. The reason we call it the action-reaction lab is because the cork, when it pops off, the test tube lab will go back. And what you need to set it up is 2 chairs, some fishing line, tape, straws, Vaseline, the cork, and the test tube.
Okay, to set this lab up, you tie a string around 1 chair, and then you put the 2 straw pieces on the fishing line, and then you tie the string around another chair, and then you put the test tube up to the straws, and then you tape the test tube around the straws, and then you put the Vaseline on the cork and put it in.
And what we're trying to prove in this lab is Newton's third law, which is for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And what should happen is when the water heats up, that'll create pressure and it'll make the cork pop off. And when the cork pops off, that should make the test tube just kind of ride right along the string. And we'll see if that works. Any second now.
Take the one.
And if you want to make it even safer, sometimes take 2 pieces of fishing line, and so if the fire burns through one, you still have another to hold the test tube up. You always want to make sure you have safety goggles, just in case the test tube explodes. And there we go. And the lab worked out just fine.
Prove one of Isaac Newton's laws of motion. We also got to see the power that's produced when water changes from a liquid state to a gas. That's what popped the cork off. It's that power of expanding steam that moves a locomotive and the train that it's pulling. Now let's look at the language of reporting a science experiment. Note that the first student listed all the materials needed for the experiment, and the second student told exactly how they set up the materials. While this may seem tedious, it's essential to clearly communicate how the experiment was conducted so that others can replicate the experiment. See, science is all about discovering and sharing knowledge and observing results that others can observe. Science has nothing to do with faith or belief. It's important that language be consistent with the nature of science when you're doing science work. The second student used sequencing to explain how to set up the experiment. He started the directions after saying, "To set this lab up, you..." Those words, plus his tone of voice, tells the viewer that he's about to give the first direction in a sequence. This is often done with words like first or initially. He introduced all the other steps with the words "and then." It's important to use this kind of language when sequencing. The word "then" is functioning as a joining word here, what we call a conjunction in English. Beyond the vocabulary of any subject, which you have started building in our trains unit, it's important to learn these function words in English. The word "and" was not necessary, and he probably would have just used the word "then" if he were writing the sequence. What he left out was the clue that the sequence was about to end. That's commonly done with the word finally, as in, finally you put the cork in the test tube. These are basic sequencing words which are essential to listing things in specific order. There are some high-level sequencing words which we'll learn in subsequent lessons, but for today, be sure you're solid in using these basic sequencing words correctly. You'll probably hear them all the time, but you might not have thought that much about them. So our homework with this time is to think of multi-step processes that list the steps in order using the words first, then, and finally. If you know other sequencing words, be sure to use them as well. If you can't think of anything else, think of the steps in a recipe. The third student explained what they thought would happen when the water in the test tube boiled, as an experiment is usually done with the expectation of results, but the scientist must be honest about the results, whether they meet the expectation or not. It's such honest experimentation and careful observation that allowed scientists and then engineers to build steam engines. Those steam engines were important not only to the railroad, but to all aspects of the Industrial Revolution. A scientific approach is more important to our lives today than it ever was, so being able to understand and practice science using your target language of English is essential to elevating your English proficiency to a higher level. This wraps up segment 3 of episode 3 of Ramping Up Your English. You'll find more resources at our website, letscreate.org. You can also watch or download this program and others by going to archive.org/details/roguetv. I want to thank my technical crew for making this program possible. I also want to thank the helpful and encouraging staff at RVTV for their help, and I also want to thank you, our viewers, for watching. We'll be back for episode 4 of Ramping Up Your English. I'm John Letts.
You've been watching Ramping Up Your English, a support program for intermediate level English language learners. Learn more. Visit our website at letscreate.org. You can also watch or download today's program at archive.org/details/roguetv. Join us next time on RVTV Voices for Ramping Up Your English.